All right, everyone, welcome back to US History. So, today we're going to be looking at the causes of World War One. Now, this is, of course, more of a world history issue that you should have taken your sophomore year, but we do need to revisit some of it because World War One is a major event where the US actually starts to go against some of its past policies of staying out of world affairs, going long, long back to our founding, and actually getting involved in what is the world up to, how are they involved politically. So we need to see where the origins came from to see how we had to make a decision whether to get in there or not. Here we go. All right, so first thing we have to address are the long-term causes of this war. World War One did not come out of anywhere. It came out of a long series of patterns and trends that had been developing for a couple centuries. So we need to go over these. On the work that you're doing in your packet, find where it says long-term causes. It looks like it's in that barrel, right? We can compare World War One and its causes to the powder keg of Europe, all these issues going on. And one thing that could represent those underlying causes are kind of the stagnant gunpowder sitting in this barrel, ready to explode, growing and filling up the barrel over time, but at the same time, not super dangerous unless there's fire or direct threats to that kind of like stagnant danger. All right, one that we've already talked about at length in class is imperialism. So we've done a few days on it. Essentially, this is European countries competing over the size of their empires and control over land, economically, politically, and socially. So we defined imperialism and what an empire is, how it's different and similar to a democracy, and can they coexist. What we see with imperialism is this had been developing all the way back since, if you remember, when European powers started to colonize the Americas, right? So coming out of the Middle Ages and when they started to have money to invest around the world, that got going there. Of course, we became independent. Many areas in South America and Central America became independent as well. And so these European powers shifted their focus to stuff in the Eastern Hemisphere instead, especially in Africa and East Asia. So these small European countries are controlling relatively large amounts of land around the world economically to use their raw resources to manufacture into their goods back in Europe and then sell back to their colonies and imperialized lands around the world. Politically, meaning that the government was controlled centrally by the European powers and there was no local control in those areas that they controlled around the world. And socially, so socially means imposing their European values on non-European and, let's be honest, non-white areas around the world. And so there becomes social control and hegemony. Hegemony means control of one group by another, where one is held to be superior and one is held to be inferior. So imperialism worked up all that. We saw that the US dabbled in it, but I'm not really answering the question whether we did it completely or not. You have an essay to do about that, right? So we've talked about this already, but it is not the only long-term cause of the First World War. The next one is militarism. So a definition of that is how those same European countries glorified their militaries, competed over how large their armies and navies were, and how powerful they were with the newest military technology. The way that imperialism was enforced politically was through those militaries that these European powers had grown over the years. And again, this happened over years and years and years of having ever increasingly large empires to administer and to keep under control. And one way to sort of manage that control is fear. And if you have the fear of being attacked physically with your overlord's military, you're going to keep in line. All right. As we industrialized as a world, and that was, remember, predominantly happening in Europe and in the United States, new technology came out of industrialization. And so by the time we get to World War I, these militaries were large. If you were in the military, you had status in society, and the militaries had brand new technology. Nothing like the world had ever seen, which meant that if a war started, it would be the first fully industrialized war. Spoiler alert, it was. All right, the next ism that we have here is nationalism. So there's a couple of different ways to understand this. The first one, when we look at the time period we are studying at this moment, is it means that a group of people with the same language and culture and social values ethnicity, all those different things should be able to be part of one nation politically. When we look at the rise of nations, especially in Europe in the 1800s, what we see is groups that used to be tiny city-states and tiny countries coming together in larger political nations. So a nation is a political unit. It used to be that there were smaller countries based on the backgrounds of those people. What happened with nation building was that you get larger ones, like the unification, I should say, of Germany under Prussian rule that happened in the late 1800s. Italy did the same thing. There used to be a bunch of tiny, smaller countries, so did Germany. And what we see is that there's certain countries within Europe that hadn't done that yet, but wanted to do it at the same time. They said, well, if we have the same language and culture and values, we should get to be one nation and not controlled by two of those isms up an empire. So that's going to sort of sow some seeds of discord in Europe and help to lead to World War I. Let's talk about what nationalism means today in contemporary times, though. In terms of modern politics, it's actually if you flip nationalism on its head. Nationalism, in essence, when it came about, it makes kind of sense to say, hey, we shouldn't be controlled by others. We are unique. We should be our own thing together. But most places are now nations. So the reverse of that type of nationalism before has turned into, if you are a nation, you should only have one language, one culture, one set of values, one ethnicity, one race. And you can see the problem of that. It gets to things like white nationalism, saying that you shouldn't have diversity in society. So nationalism started somewhere, and it's different from how we define nationalism today. Through nationalism, it also really raised sort of awareness of being proud, like overly proud of your country, because there's an attempt to all get together and be the same thing. So notice with these first three isms, all the European powers were doing this. Germany, France, Britain, Italy, they were all participating in these. Austria-Hungary, I didn't mention them. But here's the thing. They were all their own separate empires with their own militaries and their own set of sort of extreme patriotism and nationalism, but they all intertwined themselves in a system of alliances, and essentially they made political agreements, not really like alliances like together, but they were on the same side in case a war happened. So think about this. They saw what they were doing and said, it seems possible that wars might happen. Let's be on certain sides so we have allies in case of war. So these are called defensive agreements. I'm going to talk about them a little bit more on the next slide, because the next slide we're going to get away from these isms, these underlying things that had been developing for centuries, to what had been developing in Europe a little bit more close to home. So what were those alliances that I mentioned in number 4 right there? So in the war itself, we're going to get one group that's called the Triple Entente. They're also known, once the war actually starts, the Allied powers that involved Britain, France, and Russia. Now, essentially, these were European empires that began colonialism early. Britain and France used to have a lot of control of large areas of land in the Americas. They lost them. Russia was spreading from its area in Eastern Europe into all across the Asian continent along sort of the northern Siberian tundra and all that stuff. So they essentially had something in common, and so they came together. It didn't help that some of like all the European royal families were all intermarried and interrelated and stuff. Played a role there too. Now, the other alliance that we get through these treaties is called the Triple Alliance. When we get to the war itself, they are called the Central Powers. And overwhelmingly, that was Germany, Austria, Hungary, which was one country, and Italy. Something to note is Italy does change sides in World War I partway through, but they started off on the side of the Central Powers and part of this Triple Alliance. So, who were these groups? What did they have in common? They were those empires that were late to colonialism. So they did not build as a nation as quickly, so they weren't as unified. So when they looked to control other areas, well, Britain and France and Russia had already control of many of the most lucrative areas with resources. So these were the countries competing over areas yet to be imperialized. Places that weren't like really contiguous and together, they were kind of spread out, or else they were competing over Eastern Europe for the same area. So this Triple Alliance, again, and the Triple Entente it separated into groups because they had similarities. If you look at like the pictures on the right, shows you a worldview. The colors match up to red is Britain, light blue is us, dark blue is France, and then green is Russia. And you notice that the other ones don't have a lot of control. When you get to below there, it gets a bit more on Europe, and you can see what the alliances were. Lighter green for the Allied powers, darker green for the Central powers, and then kind of a Venn diagram at the bottom to show you how they overlapped with each other. It's going to be important later on. Last thing to note is these alliances were defensive agreements, and that means that it wasn't like they were allied always and they were like on the same side ready to fight. But what it meant is that if one of those sides was attacked by some outside power, then those countries they were allied to would enter the war on the side of the person who was attacked. So if your ally in this one of these treaties took the first shot or whatever, your country wasn't obligated to help them. But if they were shot at first, you had to help them. So defensive agreements, not offensive agreements, we could say. So that defines bullet number 4 a bit more for the long-term causes. Let's look at a little closer to how the war started with the short-term causes. Now, the short-term causes mostly happen because of tensions in one area of Europe, and that is the Balkan Peninsula. And that is the picture you have on the right. It's essentially when you combine the area that I'd struggle with directions. To the east of Italy, you can see Italy's little heel boot sitting there in red, where Greece and Bulgaria are, and having access between Eastern Europe and the Black Sea, and Western Europe and Southern Europe with the Mediterranean Sea. It's over that area between the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Adriatic Sea. I'm trying to do directions so you can see where they are. Hopefully I wasn't wrong. So what was going on here, and you can see this through the colors, is that Austria-Hungary and Russia were competing for who would have influence there. So you can see there that Austria-Hungary's on kind of the top left area they control, and then Russia is there in red on the right, coming in to the Balkan Peninsula. Now, whoever controlled that peninsula controlled, again, sea access going between those two seas. So for economic purposes, it was highly, highly valuable, which is in the bullet right there. Control of this region, control of trade, Western and Eastern Europe, Asia, which is further east, for you guys it's that way, and then Northern Africa, which is to the south right there. So that fits into imperialism, but nationalism was happening at the same time, where those peoples with different groups, ethnicities within the Balkans said, we don't want to be Austro-Hungarian, we don't want to be Russian, we don't want to be British or French or any of that. We want to rule ourselves. That word is known as autonomy, self-rule, and it's different from hegemony, rule by someone else on top of you. Now, a certain nationalist group that's going to play into the thing that we look at next was called the Black Hand. So one of these areas, you can see there right in the center in kind of the pinkish salmon color, is Serbia. Serbia was worried that they were going to be taken over by Austria-Hungary or one of these other empires, and they wanted to be their own nation with access to the sea. The Black Hand was a Serbian nationalist organization that wanted independence from all these empires competing over their land. They wanted all those Slavic people, like them, to be one nation without outside influence. Now, we can say nationalist organization, but where we're going to get next, they were also a bit of a terrorist organization as well. And so we're going to see what steps they took to make sure that they got their sense of nationalism rather than imperialism coming over to dominate them. All right. The spark to war. So on your chart now, you should be up at the top where there's that little fire after the fuse. The fuse was the short-term causes. So what was the spark? It happened on June 28th, 1914. I always remember that date now because my mom's birthday is June 28th. So there we go. What happened was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so not the emperor, but the emperor's son, who had a lot of ruling power as well, was visiting Serbia to do kind of like the ride through the car and wave at the people. Because remember, Austria-Hungary wanted to make Serbia part of their empire. So he and his wife riding through the streets, waving at the people. But a plan was in place by the Black Hand. It was very detailed, and it's a really interesting story. Ask me to tell it in class. I won't do it on the video. But despite all the odds against them, the Black Hand, one of their members, Gavril Princip, killed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and it's created a diplomatic crisis throughout all of Europe because a member of European royalty had been killed, and now all those alliances were starting to go into effect because it affected one of the alliances. So what happened is, reasonably so, Austria-Hungary said, hey, a Serbian nationalist just killed a member of our government. We want Serbia to investigate and find what on earth happened. However, Serbia didn't give in to the demands and wasn't super eager to investigate it because they did not want to look like they were going to give in to an empire's demands, because that might make it look like they were open to imperial pressure of taking over their land. Now, behind the scenes as well, the leader, the Kaiser of Germany, was putting a lot of pressure on the Austro-Hungarian government to tell Serbia to investigate and to not accept the answer of no, telling Austria-Hungary that said, hey, listen, if you go to war with Serbia, remember, we've got a defensive alliance, so we would be there to support you with all our industrialized military, stuff that we've been developing over all this time. So Germany kind of coaxed Austria-Hungary into declaring war on Serbia because they understood the alliances were there. But then it's kind of this cascading effect of the alliances going into effect. And by the end of July, Europe was at war, and none of these powers really had a choice because of those alliances that they committed to over the past 50 years or so. So here's the way it worked. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, but Russia had guaranteed Serbia their independence from outside influence, so Russia then had to declare war on Austria-Hungary because Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Well, now that Russia had declared war on Austria-Hungary, Germany was now obligated to declare war on Russia. And because now that Russia was in the war and war had been declared on them by Germany, now France and Britain were obligated to go into their defensive alliance for Russia against Germany and now Austria-Hungary. So this is demonstrated pretty well, if you look to the right, of what's called sort of the what is it called? Something about the chain of friendship. That's what it's called. This cartoon where you've got little man Serbia on the left, and then in comes all the friends saying, if you don't do this, I'm gonna, well, you better not, because they're all ready to go to war. And once one hits, they're all gonna hit back. So with that, Europe is at war. Notice one power I did not mention, the United States. After all, we are studying U.S. history. So in class, what we're going to look at is once Europe was at war, what did the U.S. actually do? When did we get in? Because we do join eventually, but why do we stay out and not join right when the war started? We'll do that in class. All right, thank you so much for watching, as always. Hopefully you took some good notes on that because, well, that's the whole point. And I will see you in class. Bye.